Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to Conversations on Race and Policing. My name is Cecilia Smith. I'm a recent graduate of CSUSB with an MA in History. And I'm introducing today our organizers that are here with us. We have Dr. Murray, who is a CSUSB professor in history, Roby Madrigal, who is a communications director of Fowl Library, and Professor Mary Texria, who is a sociology professor emeritus. And really quickly, I'm going to do the CSUSB land acknowledgement. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have taken responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. Today's topic is policing and sex work, and I'd like to turn this over to Mary, who will introduce our panelists, our guests.
Good day, and thank you for joining us today. We think we're going to have another really thought-provoking, informative program by two women who are deep into that research. First of all, Professor Siobhan Brooks is at Cal State Fullerton. She's an African-American lesbian feminist sociologist. This is the way she introduces herself. Known for her work with African-American women sex workers. She holds a BA in Women's Studies from San Francisco State University and a PhD in sociology from New School University in New York City. She's currently professor of African American Studies at Cal State Fullerton. So she's one of our own. So welcome, Siobhan.
Thank you.
And with her today is Dr. Cassandra Gonzalez, who is assistant professor at Sam Houston University in Houston. She is, her concentrations are in criminal justice and criminology, and she's going to tell us the difference in those two. And she studies sex trafficking of Black women and girls within the United States and their experiences with the criminal legal system as victims and offenders. She specializes in CCJ, feminist theory, and intersectional criminology. So with that, I will turn it over to them both and welcome them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we said I would start, right? Yeah, okay. So hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me, letting me join this fantastic panel. And I hope I can be a little illuminating. So I want to give a little bit more backstory. So I actually, though I live in Houston, Texas now, which is great, I am originally from a place in California called Oxnard. So some of you who live there may know it. And if you know the area, at least, I'm not gonna let you know how old I am, but at least a couple decades ago, when I was living there, it wasn't the best place to be. It was rampant with a lot of violence. There was police brutality. I lived in what is like what you consider to be like a stereotypical ghetto, like the places that researchers who weren't from these places love to go study so they can figure out what all us poor brown and Black people are experiencing life and become experts on our lived experiences. That sounded a bit more bitter than what I wanted it to be, but that came out already. I'm sorry. When I was there, I noticed that a lot of girls, and I do mean girls, I'm talking about children my own age, around 6, 7, and 8, had dates a lot. And I didn't quite understand what that meant. Mainly because my mother, who was doing what a lot of good parents try to do and try to keep me sheltered, but unfortunately the reality, she wasn't able to control what I saw a lot on a daily basis. So that's how I learned about this idea of sex trafficking. And to long story short, no one was trying to help us, or no one was trying to save us. Like, quite honestly, the only reason I didn't end up being trafficked was because I have a very stable family life, and I had a mother who was very protective over me and gave me a lot of things that eliminated a lot of the vulnerabilities that a lot of trafficking victims usually have. There were what I would consider to be like guardians of women, and they were all Black women who held around and tried to defend the girls as best as they could against their traffickers, against the buyers, against the cops who were doing what they were not supposed to be doing. And I really started to understand that the solution to things should be community. Now, I was like 80 years old at this point. I didn't know exactly, I wasn't formulating it like that. But when I, excuse me, when I got to college and I started to try to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, I kept hearing about this term modern day slavery, and I was interested. And I learned that it was the exact same thing I saw happening in my neighborhood all the time. But these folks who were writing about it were talking about how police prioritize victims, how all America's children need to be protected. And then I was like, oh, we're not America's children. Got it. So I became really disillusioned, and I decided that I'm going to focus just on the experiences of Black women and girls and sex trafficking. So, excuse me, sorry, there's really bad allergies here. So when I started to do an honors thesis, an undergrad thesis with Hillary Potter, who, if you're interested in this kind of thing, look her up, she's amazing. I was like, okay, let me see what other people have written on Black women, girls, and sex trafficking. There was nothing. This was in 2012, it's 2022, and I'm fairly confident like me and 3 other people are the only people who are working on this, and other folks are pretty much scaled out. So I decided I wanted to start working and looking at criminal justice and criminology. So criminal justice is more of like the administration of what's happening. So you're the folks who are doing like a lot of the administrative stuff, but more contemporary versions of it, folks who study criminal justice are more questioning what justice actually means in the face of so much historical disenfranchisement, historical violence, and criminology is theory. So I'm interested in like the theory of it. I'm interested in learning about research methodologies. I want to combine these two. And Jeremy, thank you, put Dr. Hillary Potter, University of Colorado, shout out to her. She's fantastic, and she was my undergrad honors advisor and my doctoral dissertation chair. So that's how great she is. So that's what I still do now. And to kind of segue into what we're talking about today, something that I really learned was, as I was studying, was the history of how intimately tied race, place, and sex are, and how that goes into policing, influencing policing behavior. Now, if I don't know the extent of like criminology knowledge of a lot of folks here, but policing is it's billed really a lot as protecting people, but police are called after something has already happened, or the police very rarely stop a crime that's in progress. They usually are called after something has already happened. So from my perspective, when I think about trafficking, I can't really figure police out because they're figuring their placement, because I'm looking at the prevention, and prevention means police have never been called because nothing has ever happened. But the history of sort of like race, place, and sex from the era of chattel enslavement, has always dictated how race is seen in the public sphere and how it gets dictated. So our first law on the books is the White Sex Slavery Act, also known as the Mann Act of 1910. It's a law we still have all the books. The white slave piece of it has since been removed, and it's used to prosecute people who move. It's usually just thought of as women and girls, but nowadays we prosecute for boys and other genders as well when you move someone across state borders for the illicit purpose of having sex. By and large, in its forced historical implementation in the early 1900s, it was majorly used to just police consenting interracial sexual relationships between adults. What was his name? Jack Johnson. He's a really famous boxer. He had to get posthumously pardoned at the behest of Mike Tyson. He was convicted under the Mann Act for moving his girlfriend, who later on became his wife, across state lines for trafficking her. So that's just kind of a little snippet to show just how long these are. And it ultimately goes to, speaking of larger social anxieties that are happening at the time, is so we look at how the street the street itself has historically been seen as like this exotic, dangerous place. And that is largely due to, honestly, studies and how studies go, because as I said at the beginning, I lived in the area that's usually seen as like the perfect little research area, because folks usually aren't from that spot, are not coming from our backgrounds. They're usually coming from like middle or upper, or like with parents who were in the academy themselves. Like I'm a first generation scholar. I'm the first person in my entire family to get a doctorate. Just to let you see that kind of schism that happens in between. But when you study, if you live in these areas, you see it's a lot more complex. There is danger there. Yeah, I'm not going to sit here and deny that there aren't dangerous places in these areas or that crimes don't happen there, because they absolutely do. But what I am saying is that historically, we've always seen the street as being this really dangerous and kind of this really dangerous and racialized area that everybody else needs to be protected from. So when sex trafficking started becoming more mainstream as a terminology, we started seeing we started really seeing the street being villainized even further than it already was, which meant that people who live on the streets and who have to work on the streets or are engaging with the streets are being further vilified than they already are. There is this kind of approach that like, oh, we're going to make this whole new policing apparatus is going to go and stop this crime. There have been very few prosecutions historically for sex trafficking. Okay, like there's data on this. You can look it up, and there have been some, and there have been some pretty large scale significant cases that are great. But ultimately, what we've seen is that these areas that have been further, that have already been under police surveillance for primarily of having poor folks who are engaged in the drug economy, folks who sell sex, sometimes consentingly, we see them being more further vilified. Something that I discovered within the disconnect between what is considered to be the perfect victim and the actual lived experiences of people. There were a lot of I see the comment, we have racists in here today. There were a lot of, I had a smart comment in my head, but now I'm trying to override it. I'm naturally very snarky. There were a lot of women who had said in my study that, yeah, I had reached out and I told this police officer at all ages. The youngest one who reported this to me, she said she was 11 years old at the time, said, I saw a police officer, I went to him to ask for help. And, he gave me back to the trafficker and said, he needed to deal with me because he didn't want to. And something I discovered when I actually sat down and read through their narratives was how often those who outcried directly said that they had a worse experience than those who just said, yeah, I'm a prostitute and go to it. And that's largely, and I'm not going to place the complete blame on that on the police officers themselves. Sex trafficking has become so incredibly prioritized and ultimately misunderstood that we have this really narrow image of what victimhood should look like, and that gets protected. And because it's so popularized and because it is used really as more of a way to get particular kinds of funding and training, people are institutions are very particular about who they put in there and who they are counting that, because they want to protect their resources. We have a lot more resources for, say, like a rape crisis center than we do for human trafficking. So there's a lot of protection, and that unfortunately means a lot of people are left behind. And it also means too, what we do see is that, again, this continued vilifying of that street and of people who do choose to consentingly sell sexual services, or who are not being trafficked, being further harmed. I'm sure I have more, but I want to take a little bit of break of a breather and see if Dr. Brooks has anything she wants to say.
Thank you for that background of your research, Cassandra. I think it's very timely, and I'm looking forward to also asking you if you had like surprising observations or anything from the actual people that you interviewed. So I'll just say a little bit about where I come into this topic more, the exotic dance side, which of course the two are intersected. So as some of you know, my background is that I used to work at a strip club in the 90s called the Lusty Lady when I was a student at San Francisco State. And I was part of a historic union movement that happened at that club. So one of the things that I observed as a dancer and also as a researcher several years later, as Mary said, I got my PhD at the New School, and I wrote a book called Unequal Desires, race and erotic capital in the stripping industry. And part of the main thesis of that book was looking at how sex industry work is very stratified. And I don't think at the time I wrote this book, people realized that it's racist, just like all other institutions. I think people just think people can be objectified, right? And so I kind of want to piggyback off of what Dr. Gonzalez said in terms of the perfect victim and flip that to also look at this notion of quote unquote white slavery, but also objectification and this feminist framework that sex work is inherently objectifying, right? And I used to say, particularly as a Black woman working in the industry, well, what happens if you can't even be objectified? Meaning you're not even hired into magazines or clubs to be on the cover, to be complained about objectification in the first place. So what does this world look like? So what I learned, and it's still happening, strip clubs are very much a microcosm of kind of what, Cassandra, you were talking about, like the neighborhood. Strip clubs embody a lot of those features. A lot of Black and brown women tend to work in strip clubs that are surrounded by a lot of the features that are representative of disinvestment, right? So when we look at policing, we also have to look at how the areas that are heavily policed are disinvested in. So when you go to a quote unquote Black strip club, with very few exceptions, you're going to see your Kentucky Fried Chicken, you're going to see your check cashing places, you're going to see your liquor stores, you're going to see a lot of things that basically outline structural racism and structural violence, and in that a heavy police presence that does more harm than good. And so in a strip club, a lot of times, and I don't think people know this, but strip clubs are rated, sometimes depending on where they're located in terms of zoning laws, liquor license, sometimes depending on the state or the club, dancers have to have like an entertainment permit to work there. And so there is a history of police officers, sometimes undercover and sometimes not, coming into strip clubs under the guise of inspection and making sure that the club is operating as it should. But basically it's very violating. So recent example of this was in San Diego. There was a club called Cheetahs. And in 2014, police came in there, and in the dressing room where dancers are very vulnerable, and they took photos and they asked a lot of questions, and they were looking at people's tattoos, all under the guise of, well, we're making sure that everyone has a permit to work there. But obviously it was very violating. So in that case, dancers actually won a settlement, which is really groundbreaking, that this violated their rights, right? But this is very common. The other thing I wanted to say that's particular to strip clubs is that sometimes women are doing different types of sex work at the same time. So one feature of exotic dance clubs is something called stage fees, right? So we have a club actually currently, the Star Garden in North Hollywood, that's on the verge of unionizing, which is exciting. One of the things that I think people don't quite understand in terms of how strippers are paid, it's not like a paycheck. That's very rare. Most strippers are not seen as employees, they're independent contractors, right? And so what's basically institutionalized is a form of payment called stage fees. So you go in and you work, and then you have to give a certain amount of your tips to the management, to the person playing your CDs, like the DJ, sometimes a cocktail waitress, like everyone gets a cut of money that actually you went on stage and made, right? And this is all under the guise of, well, you're not an employee, you're an entertainer, and basically you pay the stage fees because that's how much, you know, you're paying to dance on our stage, right? So that's where the labor issues come in, right? Because if you were really an independent contractor, you would have to, you know, sign in or, you know, make sure that you're accounted for if you're just an independent contractor. So that's a little bit of background. But if you could imagine, particularly on a slow shift, sometimes your stage fee could be $300 that you have to pay at the end of your shift, plus have enough money that, you know, makes it worthwhile that you came in for like an 8-hour shift, right? And so that creates a opportunity, right? Where sometimes because of the economic exploitation and the pressure to make the stage fee, some women are prostituting, and sometimes prostitution intersects in strip clubs, not always, but sometimes because of of those features. And then you have the added danger of the police coming in. So this is happening. The police obviously know about it. And then what happens is the police come in, sometimes undercover, on wanting to arrest women who appear as if they're going to engage in sex, right? And they pretend to be customers, and that's how they get this information. And so that's troubling, right? Because again, that does not help women. It just puts them in further danger, right? I remember when I myself was a dancer, undercover cops would come into the club and they would ask, oh, do you know where I can like find sex? Or do you know where I can get a prostitute? And if you answer, you can actually be charged with pimping and pandering, right? And so those are things that even as an exotic dancer, you think, oh, I don't need to really know much about policing or prostitution. That's not what I am. But you can still get caught up in the legal system by just not knowing, right? So those are some things that I wanted to add. The other thing I wanted to add, and then I'll throw the ball back to you, Cassandra, is I think when we look at policing, we're looking at a wide range of state control. So we're looking obviously at school to prison pipelines. We're looking at ICE, immigration policing, gender policing, and also family law, right? Like welfare, child welfare systems, which I don't think we think about when we're thinking about sex work. I know in the 90s, even being an exotic dancer, women were scared, particularly women of color, their children could be taken away. Right. I mean, this was way before J-Lo and Hustlers, and now we got pole dancing classes, and the strip club is in a rap video, and it's very mainstream, right? Back in the 90s, it was very stigmatized, which of course it still is, but more so then, and people were frightened that their children would actually be taken away, or sometimes you couldn't get an apartment if people knew that you were working as an exotic dancer. And so I want to take a break and ask you, Cassandra, do you see how any of those features are relevant in the research you've done, particularly the intersection of child welfare systems, women?
A whole lot. Okay, take a big breath because there's a lot to say here. So I would say like a good place to like kind of start looking like especially that intersection with education. There's a book, I have it somewhere in one of those bookcases back there, by an education scholar named Monique Morris, where she talks about the school to prison pipeline as it affects Black girls. Something when I was reading through, and she does note this as well, like was how many of those girls who were impacted were being sex trafficked and how they were criminalized for something that was being done to them, even though legally they can't consent to engaging in sex work. So the nexus between the child welfare and trafficking comes to vulnerabilities. The same vulnerabilities that created the child welfare system in the first place are one of the main push factors we see for sex trafficking vulnerability. So we see child abuse being one, we see child neglect, we see homelessness, starvation, all these different ways that traffickers or other predators who can swoop in, come in, and they use that. But also, and this is very unfortunate, and I can't remember which city it was, I want to say Austin. There was a CPS welfare office was caught here on an undercover from a 14-year-old girl telling her caseworker that she was hungry, and her caseworker told her, okay, go sell sex to feed yourself, instead of saying, here are the resources I can give to you. The mother has custody, but she has this caseworker assigned to her. Instead of giving her resources, her first thing to tell her was, oh no, go out and sell yourself, with the presumption that that's probably where she was going to end up anyway. So instead of actually trying to give resources that can help people, we saw some people who work within this really take advantage of that lack of care and that vulnerability. But what it comes down to is which people are throwaway people. And for children, that's largely poor children, children of color, queer children. We see that happen all the time. Vulnerability is is general because we all have multiple different vulnerabilities, but how they get acted out and how people view them, both as things that they can capitalize on and exploit, and how that actually creates an illegibility for victimhood, really pops up a lot in this observation. And I was on a human trafficking task force, and I firmly believe this, that every single person who was on there was is not dead, is a fundamentally good person, but there were definite blind spots in what they had. And that's something even they acknowledge. Like, we have a lot of victims who are sitting in jails and we don't really know what to do with that. Of course, you don't know what to do with that. You're not talking to the right kind of researchers. You're not talking to community leaders who are saying, this is the resources that we need. Stop hiring more police, give us more of A, B, and C, or stop giving them more militarized weapons. Stop giving them this, give us this instead so we can try to work on these preventative measures. And this is a real disconnect we see because child welfare was initially supposed to be more about prevention. It was supposed to be separate from the criminal justice system, but over time they have slowly merged into either being satellite or, depending on where you are, completely the same thing. That is very risky for vulnerable children, because what happens, and we see this time and time again, is that the children who need help are going into prisons, and it starts this long cycle of them going into offending as repeating offending behaviors as adults, or something worse. Sometimes they end up committing suicide or something else happens. So that nexus that's there, that connection that should not exist. And I, to be honest with you, I don't know how to separate that. I don't know how to do that because it's a lot bigger than me. But yeah, I've definitely seen a lot of overlap. And something else I want to say too, when we talk about just kind of bounce back off the strip club discussion, for a lot of sex trafficking happens in all areas of life. Okay, it does. I'm not going to sit here and say like there are not some trafficking victims who are in strip clubs, but just as Dr. Brooke described, there's stage fees. There's a lot of different kind of maintenance and other fees that goes into working for a strip club that would be taken out of the trafficker's pocket. So unless there's like a club that they particularly run or they have deep connections with, they're not particularly trying to exploit their victims there because it's taking money away from them. For traffickers, this is a business enterprise. So they are not going to try to have their victims go into someplace, especially if there's the risk of raids. They're not going to try to put themselves at risk of losing money by having one of their workers locked up or by implicating themselves. But we still see like the justification of like 90%. I see this statistic everywhere and I don't know where it came from. 90% of strippers are being sex trafficked. I have no idea where that came from. I can never find where it is. And it's just like people quoting other people. I can't find an origin source, but logically that doesn't make a lot of sense. But one of the ways that we see policing really become implicated in strip clubs does come from race, but it also comes from fears around sexuality and homophobia and transphobia, because those are generally areas that we've seen where people went to express themselves and find community that they couldn't find in, I don't want to say like larger because like give a term of scale, but outside of those spaces because they were unsafe for them. Like in multiple places along the Bible Belt in the South, like they go to strip clubs, even if they aren't actually trying to find sex or they're not actually enjoying the dancers, because that's where some of their folks are. They want to have kinship and community like everybody else does. That's a perfectly normal human reaction. Yeah, so I'm sure I have another point, but something I want to also consider, like with this child welfare as well, much like with trafficking, is how often, and I hope Dr. Brooks, you can talk this a little bit, is how often we weaponize those fears to get a lot of funding for that. Like that's primarily like when you look at and understand sex trafficking and even anti-prostitution measures overall, you have to understand the money that gets generated from doing this. And sometimes it gets put forth for like doing better trauma-informed services. Sometimes it goes down to like hiring more women police officers who know how to better talk to like survivors of sexual violence. Sometimes it goes to just like basically a surplus that goes to somewhere else in the department or to someone else that actually isn't implicated. But there's not a whole lot of oversight because it feeds into this fear and it goes into this idea, which is true, I'm agreeing with it, that children should be protected, but it goes into who is actually being protected from this. And just for women being able to say, this is my occupation of having the children taken away, you can have them being risk taken from a loving family just because you have a moral disagreement with what their job is. Are they taking them to the strip clubs? Are they being exposed to the dancers? Are they being exposed to anything or anything else like that? No, they're at home with a babysitter or someone else living their life like maybe most of us did with our guardians or parents or whomever, not interested in their jobs because we're kids. So yeah, and we can see how that does get weaponized. I haven't made a lot of observations between trafficking and womanhood, but something that I will say though, trafficking and motherhood, but For a good chunk of the folks that I've interacted with, and even like in the different roles I've served, like within anti-trafficking, we know very well in many ways that child welfare has failed and continues to fail, and how that impedes with, or how that really creates an environment for trafficking to foster. But there's not a whole lot of moves to try to fix it. It's just mainly more of like, well, we need more training here. We need more of this. I'm trained out. I don't know how much more I can get trained on. And then again, it really comes down to, like I said, like who are we more fine with throwing away? Because this is a sad reality, and I love what I do, and I love the well, maybe not love, but I have a lot of deep respect for a lot of institutions. But honestly, we see a lot of these numbers of folks who are considered okay to be thrown away or collateral damage being used to justify creation of new services for folks that don't look like them. They're being used as padding to create pathways out, or sometimes even more prevention for the ways that aren't going to go to them. I can't tell you how many times I've researched something like a funding stream of where it goes, and it goes to, and it was based off like, well, we know in this city, 60% of the juveniles who were imprisoned were actually sex trafficked. Okay, we're going to invest this into more services into this neighborhood. That neighborhood, when you actually look at it, didn't have a whole lot of it going on. It was the other areas that they were being underfunded. So there's definitely a way that we see exploitation being more complex, and who is allowed to do the exploitation, because as far as I'm concerned, that is exploitation. Can that be improved? I don't know. How we can improve that. But I do know, and this is my last point, so I'll toss it back to you, Dr. Brooks. Something that we do see is that also going on with vulnerability, the issues of labor, like consenting labor, and who are paid adequately and fairly, or the working poor, or working poverty, whatever terminology we have, because it changes every so often. That's also another pathway for folks to be preyed upon. Like, I know you're not making this much money working at CVS or something like that, or I know you're not making enough money doing this because it doesn't keep up with cost of living, doesn't come up with cost of food, doesn't come up with property taxes if you own, or anything else that happens, like, oh, insurance, your diabetes medicine is how much? $1,600? How much are you paid? $400? Oh, I can help you with that. Once you create that desperateness, that vulnerability for people trying to live, especially for so many areas that don't allow or really restrict worker protection or worker harmony, like such as unions, we can really see like the kind of larger tentacles that can leak out and bleed into society that create these situations that we rally around and say are horrible, but there are very real measures we can take outside of it. We just largely don't do it. So I was hoping, Dr. Brooks, you could talk more about like the power that came to a lot of the workers once they began to unionize and advocate for fair working conditions.
Thank you for that. Yeah, definitely. So again, I'll just use the Lusty as a model. And again, we were a very privileged position because we were already employees. That was a big reason why we were able to unionize with SEIU Local 790. So for us, it was, and I think this is again common in strip clubs, like any institution, racial stratification, even when you have women of color working in the same place. So for us, Black women weren't allowed to work in what used to be called the private pleasures booth. They call it sometimes a champagne room, in some clubs a VIP room. It's basically a part of a club where you have the opportunity to make more money, one-on-one with a customer. And again, we were separated by glass, but some places this is like lap dancing, like kind of like physical contact, but within legal, means. But the point is, that's what you want. Like basically the stage is where people advertise themselves. And then like the intimate room, whatever it's called, is where usually someone will make the most money because they already saw you on stage, if that makes sense. So that's kind of like you advertise who you are. And then somebody might say, oh, I think I want to see Candy one-on-one because I just saw her perform, right? Well, Black dancers weren't allowed to have that second option to make money, right? And in some other clubs, this, stratification might be different. It might be, yeah, you work there, but you work on a shift that's not lucrative, or, they put you on a dangerous shift at night. So maybe you are making a little bit of money, but then how do you get home at 2 a.m.? And again, that's back to that safety piece we were talking about. So there are many ways that particularly Black dancers, I want to be clear, it's dancers of color, but often it's specifically dark-skinned Black dancers that either don't get hired, or if they are hired at certain clubs, they're stratified into the less sort of profitable modes of work in the club. So in our case, the union helped us to hire more Black dancers in all aspects of the club. At this point, dancers, again, 90s, internet is very new. I know it's hard for some people in the audience to imagine life before the internet, but that was us. And so to have a video camera was like a form of technology that was like, wow, you know? And so people were coming in sometimes and videotaping dancers without their consent, because there were windows where we couldn't see who was behind it. It was kind of designed for people who wanted to be discreet. And so that was a concern, because people thought with this new enterprise called the internet, because this is like circa 1996, what's happening with those photos? So the union, you know, ensured that those windows were removed, that people could, you know, not be reprimanded if they called out sick. You had to have a replacement if you were sick, which was hard for Black dancers. If there aren't a lot of Black dancers, how do you find somebody to replace your shift, you know? Because they wanted like the mirror copy of you if you were going to be absent. Oh, we want another person that kind of looks like you to replace that shift. And so there were a lot of good things that came from the union. And I think the main thing was trying to alleviate the stigma of what it meant to be a stripper, because I think in both what you know, you and I are talking about, Cassandra, you know, the anti, you know, sex work stigma, along with the racism and the classism and sometimes the transphobia, is what really makes people on edge and positioned on edge, where they are vulnerable either to, like in your research, sex trafficking, or just violence, you know, police violence, client violence. And that brings me to something that you were talking about, sort of agency. I know, again, in the 90s, there was a group called Coyote, Cast Off Your Old Tireways. And, you know, I really admired them, but they were mostly white women, very privileged, and they were kind of working from, like, well, now we say working from home because of COVID, but, you know, before all that, they were basically able to have like, you know, clients and work inside, you know, which was very privileged as opposed to outside sex work. These group of women already had like clients and technology. And so that brings me to FOSTA and SESTA, right? Fight, you know, the bills that recently turned into law, both the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act and the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, right? Which was signed into law in 2018, which basically criminalizes like sex workers and sites for advertising or, you know, having any sort of like online sort of presence of who you are, of your work, because then it could be seen legally as, oh, well, this is promoting sex trafficking, we have to get rid of that. But really it was about autonomy, right? And it seems interesting that at a time when maybe, you know, a more diverse sex worker population is getting access to online advertising, because again, in the 90s when this was happening, it was very privileged, it was white. And I'm sure there are elements still that are, you know, stratified that way, but also we know more Black women and women of color have taken control of like websites and, you know, internet to advertise themselves. So it's interesting that when we start getting that technology, these laws start to come in to restrict, right, online presence, which puts more sex workers actually at a disadvantage, because those are online communities of resources, of warnings about maybe dangerous clients that are circulating in a community that now you cannot post, right? You can't post it. And then also, you know, the internet server, whoever it is, will get in trouble as well if they post it, right? And so I don't know if that's something that, Cassandra, you found in your research too, how these two acts have affected safety and how sex workers mobilize or advertise themselves.
So the most I came across it of the FOSTA SESTA was more with people trying to understand how it actually was working as anti-trafficking. Something that came up again and still comes up actually in some other research projects that I have is how often the bare minimum meets those, like we have enough to be suspicious that you're about to engage in sex work, such as carrying condoms or wearing clothes that they view are, you know, what people who want to work on the street look like. Especially the condoms is really the most suspicious ones with this more like archaic societal idea that women won't carry around condoms and only men do, but women carry condoms around for their own personal safety and just if they just want to in case they want to be prepared. So just how often that has come up, but just how much money that funneled into a lot of anti-trafficking efforts that worked into really more policing consenting sex workers is really what's so surprising. There's a podcast, I forgot the name of it, but they did like do a really deep dive into it. And I learned some stuff that I didn't even come across before, mainly because they interviewed some folks who worked in vice squads who got some funding through this new, through a lot of these new anti-trafficking efforts that happen. And they're just like, yeah, this really allowed us a lot, gave us more resources to do more of what we were already doing, but we aren't getting more with trafficking. We're just basically arresting more prostitutes, and I'm using their terminology. We're just arresting more prostitutes for a longer period of time, but we're not doing anything much else beyond that. It gets wrapped up into this idea of like, again, you're cleaning up the streets. And the bad part about that, like the mobility that came, the like social mobilization that came out of shutting down Backpage on Craigslist. So for those who may be too young for this, Craigslist in its earlier times had a place called Sexual Encounters, and also for Backpage.com, which is something separate. But Craigslist had a consensual encounters or casual encounters, I forgot the exact terminology it was, for people to advertise like if they're just feeling a little frisky and wanted to find someone real quick without commitment. But there were some folks who sold sex through there, and some occasionally there were someone who were being forced to go on there too. Like that did happen, there's no denying that. But the scale to which that justified that was used to justify hammering down and making working environments for consenting sex workers less safe was really disturbing. They were no longer they had less ability to screen potential clients. They had less ability to arrange where they're going to be. If you're like selling sex on the street, you have to be really aware of who's around you so you don't get busted. So that means you either have to get into a car, and when you get into a car, you are at the mercy of whoever is picking you up at that moment. Regardless of whether your views in sex work are, we should always prioritize someone's safety. So if you're for it or for against it, the concern should be that the fact that when they get in there, they can be at a great amount of risk, which is one reason why we know serial predators and such like serial killers and folks like that will target prostitutes or sex workers, because society said that you chose that and put them on the side, while also again at the same time, and it's so paradoxical how we do this, saying we need to prevent this from happening, we need to prevent them because they're victims. And that was one of the main reasons behind FOFA-SESTA. Use a lot of anecdotal evidence of which does happen. Sex workers do face a great deal of violence. I'm not going to pretend that doesn't happen either, but we saw that it was really used like a lot of more extreme cases of like killing, of some other severe kind of violence, or of minors who were being picked up, and really use it to police consenting sex work. So who is it? It's a celebrity. He was on that 70s show. Whatever, some actor on some show somewhere. Ashton Kutcher was one of like the main celebrity voices that was speaking out against the presence of another website called Backpage, which was an avenue for sex workers to advertise what they were selling. And he was also one that really regurgitated a lot of information and data that we don't know where it came from, of saying the vast majority of women who are on here, and it wasn't just women, they were also men and transgender and genderqueer folk on there too, and they always get left out of the conversation. But a lot of these girls that are on here are being forced to do this, and we need to shut it down. And there was, congressional hearings about it until eventually finally it was shut down by the feds. But another like ricochet effect on that too was how difficult that actually did make some law enforcement efforts to find actual trafficking cases when they were using it, because they had a paper trail to follow for evidence, and they had an actual way of tracking down more victims if they had any. So they actually, for some law enforcement, lost a valuable tool with this morality around we need to end all sex work because all sex work is exploitative. So we did see that actually happening. So there was additional increase of policing of consensual sex workers that made their working situations a lot less safe. And that was really one of the prime benefits of the internet, was that how much it allows us to surveil and plan ahead for someone. But also, again, for them too, it leaves a paper trail in case something happens. Everything on the internet, once you put it on there, it stays. And for law enforcement too, like it did help us, do a lot more with busting consensual sex work, but it also made our job a lot more difficult in some ways with trying to police trafficking, because we couldn't find them. And it's much more easy to make someone disappear off of the street than it is on the internet. But again, this is just proof that no one who was doing really good legitimate research was actually involved in drafting that bill, because that would have been the first thing I think anybody with basic experience research in this would have told you, because that was my first thought when they were just talking about it. I was like, well, how are you going to find them then after that? Because like I said, there's historically been very few cases that have been tried for trafficking, like that have been tried for trafficking. For the most part, they either tend to get like lost, mistried, or they just don't happen. So yeah, the phospho-SESTA made a huge mess of things,
to say the least. I know we're getting to our time for Q&A, but just like there was an earlier question geared your way about kind of the difference between like criminal justice and criminology. We hear a lot about legalization of sex work, decriminalization, and that third European model, the Nordic model. Briefly, could you talk about your understanding of the differences between those three requests?
So legalization, which is actually the model we have in Nevada, means that sex work is legal under certain strict guidelines. So that's like age requirements, where you can work, how many people can be there, et cetera, et cetera. And usually it also means you have to like submit state sponsored or like have to report normal STI checks, HIV, age status, and things like that. The decriminalization means that there's no oversight at all. It's pretty much left like, if you're an adult and you're doing this, it's not our business, and they move on. Now the Nordic model, which I think it began in Norway first and then spread out to a couple other Scandinavian countries, looks at it went another way. So they said that sex work itself is not what we're policing, it's the buying of sexual services. So sex workers and critics say different things about each one, largely from the sex worker groups that I follow, really more support the decriminalization because they say there's more individual agency. They have obvious critiques of the legalization, the model, but for the Nordics, something that they said was that also creates a condition of less safety, because now the people who are wanting to buy their services are the ones who could potentially get in trouble, which means that they have more to lose than the sex workers do. So, and that also meant too that they were not allowed to like book normal places, that they weren't allowed to have them at their own places that were normally safe. And clients said, well, no, I'm the one who's taking the risk. You're going to come to where I want to, which again, that means that they are at the mercy of whoever that they are at. Now, there are some sex workers who praise it and say like, okay, good, like this, this industry only spurs because we have a demand for it, criminalize the demand. So it was really an idea. And I think it's one of those ways that we see like things with good intentions and with goodwill really kind of backfire again, is that the idea was really to like not criminalize the women. I saw women and girls being used primarily, especially if that's not something that they want to do. So treat them as, what they're doing, maybe not as legal, but definitely is not something that they're going to be harmed for. But while the person who's enabling said harm should be the one that's worried. But when that happens, you give a no sum game for that, unfortunately. So that Nordic model is not used anywhere else except for certain countries in Europe, and I focus on the US, so I can't say the effectiveness of it personally. But we do know, like for things like even with legalization, we still see the same problems. So like we do still see, even if they aren't being picked up for like prostitution charges for something else, like low grade pandering or vagrancy, different things like that, or assault, like if they defended themselves against a buyer or the brothel manager or something else like that. So we still see them find ways to really criminalize if they want to. And we do see that really getting stratified by race, by socioeconomic status, and everything else like that as well. Which is why I realized just now we haven't really spoke too much about abolition itself. So I'll formulate like how I talk about abolition, like what I think it is, and then volley it back to Dr. Brooks. So I originally got into this to try to figure out like ways that we can best improve policing for sex trafficking. And right now, honestly, even like with working with some police officers and getting their input, a lot of them are like, we're trying our best. And I do believe that in a lot of cases. I do believe that they're trying, but again, we're up against mountains and we're ants. What are we supposed to do? But what I really have looked at is that, again, like police respond to things that have already happened. So when I think of abolition, personally, I think about investment in community and having community elevate and protect itself to prevent these things from happening, or at very least try to minimize the vulnerability to make it harder and make it easier for for people to get help that they need. One of the number one takeaway that happened from my dissertation research, and I asked them, like, how do we get justice? Not a single one of them said, like, oh yeah, through the criminal legal system. Some of them explicitly said no. For the most part, the vast majority of them said, like, we need to really love and value and listen to Black women, and just do that first as a community, and then get everybody else in society to happen. And therefore, we will no longer be throwaway people. And I think that can happen for every vulnerable group that we see getting targeted for participating in sex work, or who are preyed upon and get sexually trafficked. So that's where, for me, abolition comes in. It's not even like connected. I know abolition gets talked about a lot with like the CJS system and policing and everything else like that. And for me, it's removed from that. Like that's for me to think about later on. For me, abolition means really deconstructing and destroying the harms that happen first, that create vulnerabilities, and really work on that as a prevention model, so that we don't even have to worry about the CJS system, because these things are not happening. So that's my view of it as it's going on with like my research and what I'm able to do, at least. I'm interested in hearing Dr. Brooks's definition.
Yeah, thanks for that. I would just basically second everything that you're saying. And I guess the only caveat I would add, my current book, which I was brought on here last year or a couple of months ago around this time, to talk about everyday violence against Black and Latinx LGBT communities. And one of the things I talked about in there, which when you were talking, Cassandra, that kind of brought up some of the conclusions I had on this topic as well, an investment in schools, right? In sort of the ways in which we need to value Black and Brown LGBT folks, but at the stage of youth, right? And, children, which are the most vulnerable to a lot of this, basically these forms of state violence, right? Religious reform, because both of these topics stem from the religious right trying to control, what we do with ourselves. I mean, we see Roe versus Wade, what happened there, but this is all connected, right? And so I think an investment in actual economics for people trying to raise children in communities of color across the board, that needs to be invested in. So again, similar to what you're talking about with just the policing in terms of sex work, the child welfare system is also like a precursor to that in my mind. And similarly, you have good people, caseworkers, we all know them, trying to work in that system, social work, but a lot of times what they end up doing is destroying families, right? And so that puts people at risk in a different way for what we're talking about today, with understandings of sex trafficking, or just precarious sex work in general, where you are at risk of being attacked or marginalized further with police violence, right? So I would basically say resources, really, just and the alleviating the stigma that still comes with sex work. Because I think there's this notion, which is valid. Some people do feel forced into sex work, right? So I don't want to paint it like everybody is just like, oh, I'm swinging off a pole because it's fun. And some people really would have probably done something else had those opportunities been there. That part is real. And at the same time, not everybody is coerced into whichever forms of sex work we're talking about, right? And so making that distinction, the people that don't want to be in sex work, what do they need? And then the people that want to stay in it, what do they need to have like safe, enhancing experiences, right? So those are things that I would add. Mary, I don't know if you were going to lead the Q&A, or if you think this is a good time to kind of bring
Sure,
in.
and thank you both for that. That was just wonderful. Again, exceeded our expectations, and you've opened our eyes to kind of an underworld, because it is not obvious, to sort of the average person driving down the street that you have all of these issues and all of these things going on. I'm just wondering, we do have several questions, but I've got a couple. Just wondering if you've had any pushback, and this is for either of you or both of you, pushback from academia, because it's a whole different world than the world that you've been a part of, that you've studied, and that you're telling the world about now. I'm just wondering if your colleagues have been open and receptive to your research.
Might have at least. So my colleagues at Sam Houston State University have been extremely supportive. Really great. When I did my job talk, I was very nervous though, because what I study and how I study it is considered unorthodox or controversial, even though it shouldn't be. So I was nervous about it, but they're like, we like this. We like your stance on, and I was hired for a cluster of like racial justice as well. So that obviously fits with what I do. However, caveat, colleagues outside of my department. Yes. So early on, when I first began my dissertation study, I got an email from a couple of irate people, some of whom are in the trafficking field, basically saying like you're like there's no room pretty much to like it's the same thing. We already know what's being said, et cetera, or do like go and saying that you're studying prostitution, not sex trafficking, which is a whole other language game that we don't have time to get into, but boy, is that loaded. But one extremely volatile email I got was from someone who I knew has to be a scholar just from how they used it, but they made an anonymous email to send to the studies emails where I made connections with people, and just basically said like, I don't know why you want to do this. Black people are to blame for all their problems. Pretty much like basically said like, there's no such thing as a Black trafficking victim. And then just said like, obviously there's something wrong with me, I'm useless, and all those other horrible things. And then I got a phone call, and I'm fairly confident it was the same person from a block number. So I took my phone number off of the flyer after that, that said the same thing, but also called me the N-word and then hung up. And they did it from a block number, so I couldn't even call them. I was like, at least be brave enough to say it with your name. And sometimes a couple times when I present at conferences, and they're like, well, I don't understand. I look at it from a victimization framework, and I look at actually the first form of victimization is anti-Black racism that's specific to Black women. That's what I say is actually the number one vulnerability that helped create a pathway to everything else. And that part that I study is really not, I don't know how to say this. In criminology and criminal justice, we are more prone to studying racial disparity rather than racism itself. Like racism as a structure, we're more good looking at like, these are how these numbers skew with these racial groups, which is needed. There's a lot of value with studying that, but that's not what I do personally. I'm talking about, we need to go to a further deep dive into the effects of colonization and chattel enslavement, and how that actually has resulted in this institution of what we call slavery and how that impacts. So, at my work, 100% positive. Outside of it, it's 50-50.
Dr. Brooks?
Yeah, I think for me, the journey has been interesting, and I guess I'll say that I've been very fortunate. So let me just frame it that way. And I think that because of the historic union movement that I was a part of, I was able to, and I hate to say this, but Cassandra, you can relate, it is what it is. I was able to legitimize what I was doing under the guise of being a union organizer, not so much being a stripper, because there are different risks involved with Black women being in the sex industry and then trying to move in other social menus from that experience, right? I would like to say, and this is my humble opinion, that I help frame the groundwork for what we see now with sex worker studies that other Black and Latina women are doing from my own experience and my own work in the 90s. I would like to say that I'm a pioneer in that field of work. Whether that's in sociology, gender studies, slowly in ethnic studies, because prior to that, there wasn't really anything out there. And there definitely, in my opinion, there still aren't a lot of studies or research from Black women who were also former sex workers, right? And that's deliberate, right? Because of all the social barriers that we talked about. So I think because that union movement had intertwined right when, because I was a little older, Mary, when I went back to school. So, I went back to school when I was 27 for my master's. And I say that because now I look at colleagues coming in now, I'm like, wow, you got your PhD at 30? I'm like, assistant professor, 28 years old. Right. I'm like, wow, okay, I was still in the movement, so to speak, like in that the world prior to when we decided we want to become academics. And I think that was very strategic because before applying to grad school, I knew I had to get my people in order to protect me from what could have happened. So I already met somebody, Franz Wendance Twine, who's at UC Santa Barbara, became my mentor, a very prominent sociologist who I had met way before I even thought about grad school. So it was a very different relationship that had formed from that versus already knowing her in academia. And then she became my mentor. And then through her, I started to meet other people. So it was sort of like a little, like kind of group of academics that I already associated myself with even before applying to grad school, because I knew I had to have ammunition. I had already published when I was in my 20s. And it was those articles were already being used in like gender studies and sociology prior to me going to grad school. So I already knew I had to have a reputation that was respectable before making that journey of, okay, now I'm a PhD, right? And so I think that because those two things happen at the same time, by the time I started doing academic research, I was already seen as a researcher. Even though obviously my background had been somebody who was in the industry, I was able to kind of morph that into a field study. And my committee members, sometimes it's in our benefit when people don't really understand a topic. So on my committee was all men. And I think, yeah, they were very fascinated, to say the least. Right. You can imagine,
Wow.
right? Woman, my topic, 3 men,
Yeah.
right. Right.
Yeah.
And so they were extremely fascinated by that topic, that to the point where, no, they're not going to fail me. But I don't think they always understood what I was doing. So I had outside feminists who were actually reading my chapters like, okay, give me the real deal here. Because I got my committee and they're just sort of, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. I'm like, okay, so you're just going to pass me, but I still need to know methods. So I had my team, Mary. I had my team because I knew that could be a very dicey, complicated trajectory.
Yeah. Well, what you have done without probably knowing it is given an outline to our students who are thinking about graduate school, because I think it sounds like you approached it very strategically in terms of gathering your people, and you emphasize how important it is to have the right people. And also, I loved what Cassandra said at the beginning. She said there was no research, and those of us who are researchers, we get excited about that. There was no research on, or very little, on sex workers. And I'm just wondering how far back the literature goes. And I'm assuming because of Cassandra's and your statements that it doesn't go that far back, where people have actually studied sex workers and strip clubs and that kind of thing.
No, I mean, I'll just jump in real quick and then hand it over to Cassandra. I think there has been a study, and this is no disrespect to, the 4 feminists that came before us, but I think what was more acceptable, I'll say that, is work by some Black feminists that specifically look at how pornography objectifies Black women and how that's rooted in slavery, and that Black women have always kind of come into sex through rape and violence. I think that literature has always been there. And I think that that's dominant, and it's changing. But I think that, when you try to look at sex work, there was nothing about anything to agency. People, it was always sort of controlling images. And again, I love Pat Hill Collins, right? Ode to her. But like, that framing that we can only come into sexual discourse through violence and rape, and I think that that's deliberate, right? That there's a lot of research funding for that angle that kind of looked at least at that time, Black women as victims in terms of any aspect of sex. And if you're talking about pornography, is only in the form of being exploited.
And it's probably, I could be wrong, but rooted in sort of Judeo-Christian values. And, we're not going to legitimize or legitimate sex workers or by writing about them like they're human beings.
Right. But see, but the flip side was that when you look at like white feminists, right? Whether they're in this industry or not, you know, and I love Elizabeth Bernstein's work, but when you look at that, it's interesting how that outlet has always led to more nuance, looked at how women, and usually white women, come into things like pornography and sex work. You see what I mean? So there's always been that room of like the many variant identities and agency, but usually that's with white feminist, right? Not so much Black feminist.
Cassandra, did you want to comment?
I agree. There's always some sort of research you can draw on. The question is if that research, A, is answering the questions that you're asking, and B, if it was actually done in good faith or if it was actually done accurately. And I think, and this is something that we don't really talk about because there's so few Black women in the academy, is actually the respectability politics that a lot of like the four mothers who did like Black feminist work in the academy just wanted to espouse. Like it was considered smut, it was considered like a dirty little secret or of something else, instead of actually being a legitimate field of study and a legitimate form of work that that deserves more exploration beyond this is what someone is doing to these poor women and girls due to racism, or anything else like that. And just how often that gets repeated over and over again, because that was something that I kept coming up with again, was basically I felt like I was being preached to and I don't need to be preached to, or anything else like that. And that's really the value that a lot that is like with a lot of these more younger scholars coming up, because they have more tools to fight back against them and to really dismantle. Like I didn't have a lot of the language of respectability politics and fighting it until I met Dr. Hillary Potter, because she taught me about that. And she taught me about ways to really prepare myself as a Black woman in the academy for the ways that my work is going to be attempted to be delegitimized. And so far, everything that she said has come true at some point. So, you know, and that's what happens. And that's why I always like try to urge, like, we need more diverse scholars from all disenfranchised backgrounds too, who study these issues, because they understand these communities. Like I don't need someone who grew up on the Upper East Side or middle class or something and went to an Ivy League university telling me about what, you know, Black womanhood in the hood means. I don't need anyone to tell me that. I know what it means. And I don't need to sit here and be told that I don't understand what my worldview properly is, because I'm not using the proper theoretical framework. And unfortunately, that was some of the origins that we came up against. So I really like seeing this work that's really like saying, no, this is how we're looking at it. This is a different argument. I really like seeing that and not going more for like just replicability. I can never say that word. See, I'm so against it, I can't say it.
And I want to put out a plug, because, you know, as scholars, we want to acknowledge our colleagues. So Mireille Miller-Young at UC Santa Barbara, she has a book called A Taste of Brown Sugar, A History of Black Women in Porn, which is absolutely fascinating as someone who's also been a pioneer in this field.
Well, fantastic. We should probably get to some of the questions. Jendaya Lee sent actually two, and I'll read them at the same time. Sex work is bad until it's porn, then it's okay here in America. Why is that? And her other question, there are multiple cases in America where women who were sex trafficking at a young age are being put into jail for fighting and even killing their abusers and buyers. What can we do to combat this?
So for the first one, I'll surface level answer that. So surface level, my response to that is because pornography is viewed as something that could be done in private normally. So that's something that like you download or you buy and you consume it on your own personal time, versus like with sex work when it's on the street. That's when the outrage comes, because people can see it and say it's somehow affecting them even when it isn't. For the second one, yeah, like you can think of so many cases like Crystal Kaiser, Centoya Brown Long. There's a couple local cases here in Houston of a couple different kinds of minor girls. The way to prevent that, and these are all in states too, the most of them have what we either call safe harbor laws, where they should be able to claim some sort of like, not safe harbor, I'm sorry, like affirmative defense law outlines to say like, you know, the things that the crimes that I committed connected to sex trafficking, such as killing someone in self-defense, should be mitigated by the fact that I'm a child who is being forced to do this. And oftentimes it's really difficult for that to be successful. Crystal Kaiser has been allowed to have some come through. And there's a girl and she's in Tennessee and her case was just all over. Her last name is
who you're talking about.
Yeah, and
She was released, wasn't she? She
Yeah.
was after many years. She was
Mhm.
trafficked when she was a teenager,
Yeah.
and she wound up not killing her pimp, but killing one of her clients, I think.
Oh yeah, that's Centoya Brown.
Right,
Yeah, so she
right,
served
right.
over a decade, I think it
I
was.
think she served quite a while.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and she had to get a clemency from the governor of Tennessee at the time.
Yeah, right.
And she has a book too that you can listen there, and it's really really interesting to see her journey. But so often, for those defenses to be successful, you have to be seen as a victim. That's the thing. And a lot of times too, they really will not cover violent crime, which even if it's in self-defense, murder and killing is a violent crime. So they're automatically excluded, and there have to be special exceptions. But again, for those arguments to be seen as valid and be convincing, you have to be able to be seen as a victim. So Crystal Kaiser is able to use some aspects of the affirmative defense in her case as it's being built. And I really wish I could remember the name of the recent one I saw, and she's 19, and the judge made a comment. She stabbed the man who was sex trafficking her and had raped her since she was a teenager 30 times. And the judge had said, like, you need to think about what you did because you robbed the children of their father. Like, this grown man hadn't been violently assaulting this child this whole time. She instead had a plea deal instead in order to avoid serving major jail time. But yeah, so the first place that we need to combat that is, again, really sort of looking and combating ways that we're really seen. And really, I do think, and this is something that gets me in trouble sometimes with some folks who say sex trafficking, is really stop demonizing a lot of consenting sexual behavior, so we can actually address the parts that actually are deviant. Because so much of this overreaction is that we need to hurry up and start making examples of these really bad crimes to keep going on with this crime and justice model. But the thing is, sometimes those really big crimes are exemplifying more of what you were trying to prevent more than anything else. So yeah, I think that's the first place where you can really start. And I also think too, we need to have better training, not just for police, but for lawyers and for judges, because a lot of them really don't have the proper training to recognize what trafficking actually looks like. We focus a lot of our training just on law officers because they're usually the first point of contact. But after that first point, it goes to people who are a lot more powerful than them. And ultimately, if you get in front of, like, the most powerful person really usually in this scenario is actually a DA who makes the decision of what charges to file and when to file them and how to do it. Having that proper training with someone who knows, like, okay, this is self-defense, what else can we do? What are the other options that we may have, versus saying, like, oh, you're going to get tried for murder or second degree manslaughter or something else like that. And I think the third one, which is a lot harder, a lot of states' criminal codes really need to be updated because they were really made with the assumption that the people who are committing these crimes are black and white evil, and human behavior isn't black and white at all. So we really need to start. So there are the three things: really demystifying a lot of these acts, but also just in general seeing people as people, and therefore they can be seen as victims. Proper training to recognize these different things, and then also, please, can we start just really reforming and revamping a lot of these laws that are being weaponized, unfortunately, even if it's not deliberate in these kind of instances.
Right. Well, Dr. Brooks, it looks like we have run out of time. If you want to make a quick comment on what Dr. Gonzalez just said, or the question.
Just maybe real quick wrap up, just to that question about why does pornography seem more acceptable. One of the things that just briefly came to my mind was the fight to try to make it respectable in terms of Hollywood with films. Like, just trying to make it seem like it's part of the film industry, right? That's what happened in the 70s. So that's my only caveat, again, kind of not necessarily maybe respectability politics, but more, well, this is a art form, or this is, this is movie making, right? But all kind of grounded in a sort of Judeo-Christian morality too. I mean, it appears that, when people are petty thieves or, some other minor crime, they're not vilified in the same way that women who engage in any form of sex work are vilified. So it's, racism, sexism, it's all those isms in that one microcosm of sex workers. Thank you both so much. We have overstayed
force you to overstay your welcome. So you will definitely hear from us again, but thank you both so much. This is going to be, as you know, Dr. Brooks, it's going to be recorded, so you will have access, especially, you know, for tenure purposes. I think it's always good to have, you know, some artifact of what you've been doing, obviously. So it'll be available in just a few weeks, but thank you both so much for visiting us, and you, Dr. Brooks, visiting us once again.
Thank you for having us.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
You're welcome. We'll talk soon. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.